How's it guys? My name is Michael Applesamy and I'm from Wild Eye. And over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing a couple of video tutorials starting off right at the basics, whether it be in Lightroom and photography, and moving into a couple of more advanced topics as we go along. So if you guys happen to have any questions or any videos you'd like me to cover, get in touch with me and let me know, and I'll be happy to do some videos on those topics. But for now, let's get into today's one. So today we are going to be focusing in Lightroom as basic as it gets, and focusing on the basic panel for today. For now, let's start right at the top here, going through our histogram at the top. Now, what the histogram allows us to see is it's a graphical representation of the tones and colors in a photo, and it offers us a fast way to check each image for exposure and contrast issues. So how it's broken up is, on the far left we have our blacks. I try and remember it with blacks having the L, the blacks are on the left. We then move over to our shadows. In the middle we've got our midtones. Just to the right we've got our highlights, and on the far right we've got our white. White rhymes with right, so that's how I try to remember it. So that's just a breakdown of our histogram over here. In the top left corner and the top right corner, if we click on these little triangles over here, this will then in our image show us where we say it as clipped these specific colors in our image. So for example, on the blacks, if we put this triangle on, in our image, if it highlights anywhere, as you can see here, it will highlight in blue for the blacks. If there is any highlights, that is telling us that we've lost detail at that specific point, wherever those highlights are on our image. For example, if I bring my exposure down here, just to exaggerate it and show you guys, you can see we've then lost detail in all of these spots of the image. So that's what switching this triangle on and off will show us. The same for the whites. If I, again, very exaggerated, go and stretch out my white here, or my exposure, wherever it is red, highlighted in red, that is telling us we've lost detail on that specific spot of an image. So that's a breakdown of our histogram. Whenever you're taking your photos in general, you want to try and focus on not clipping and losing the detail in the blacks or the whites of that image. And therefore, coming back to your histogram, you'll have a look towards your blacks and towards your whites. You don't want the lines to go above the top here. So that's our histogram. Moving under the histogram, underneath here we've just got a breakdown of the settings that we used for the specific image. So with this image I was shooting at an ISO of 640. My focal length was at 400 millimeters. My aperture was at f8, and my shutter speed was at 1,000th of a second. So that covers the top half of our basic panel for now. Underneath here, we've got our crop overlay. A shortcut for that is using the letter R on your keyboard. As you can see, I've already cropped this. And to the right, this little plaster is our blemish tool. The shortcut for that is Q on your keyboard, and that allows you to remove spots within your image. Moving to the right, we've got our red eye removal, and lastly, if you want to add a mask to an image. But that's something we'll cover on another day. For now, we're going to keep it here in the basic panel, and I'm just going to run you guys through all of these sliders and try to keep it as basic as possible for you. So firstly, we've got our temperature. Temperature basically refers to, as it says, the temperature of the image. It either adds a coolness to our image, or it adds warmth to our image. Warmth being a slightly more yellow orange tone, and cool being a more blue tone. So that you can play with sort of to your preference. In this type of image, I quite like the look of the blue sky in the background, so I'm going to bring my temperature down a little bit just to add a bit of coolness into this blue sky. Tint, very similar, works on pinks and the greens of an image. Alrighty, so then moving on, we come down here to exposure. Now exposure refers to how bright an image is. Less exposure means the image is darker. More exposure means it is brighter. So that's as simple as it gets. Your exposure refers to the brightness of the image. In this case, I'm going to bring it down maybe a touch here. Alrighty, then next we have contrast. Now, contrast, it works on the adjustments, and what it does is it darkens the darker midtones and lightens the lighter midtones across the image. So referring back to our histogram, the contrast would work on the midtones here, which is found in the middle. So if we stretch out this contrast, you'll see that it either compacts our midtones or it stretches them out, exactly as it says. It focuses on those midtones. So that is what your contrast is going to do. Generally, I don't really work on contrast here. I would rather come into my tone curve where I will focus on working in these specific points. But that, again, is for another day. Today, we're going to try to keep it as basic as possible. Secondly, our highlights. Our highlights, as it says, focuses on the highlights of an image. It will, which refers to this column within our histogram. It stretches out in those specific points of the histogram. It stretches those tones out, either darkening the highlights or lifting those highlights. The same with shadows, whites and blacks. Shadows, it's either going to darken the points of shadows, which are over here in our histogram, or it's going to lighten the shadows within our histogram. Whites, the same thing, either stretches them back. And this is where we keep an eye on where we've potentially clipped or lost detail in certain parts of our image. The same for our whites. If we come in over here, it's going to either bring down our whites or it's going to stretch them out. And again, always focus, again, this is very exaggerated. However, always keep an eye on where the reds may pop out. So if I've got this on over here, I can see that I've lost details. So I'm definitely going to want to bring back my whites within this image. And the same for the blacks. If we turn on our clipping indicator over there, we can see where we start to lose detail. And you want to try focus on that. Try keep as much detail in most of your image. It depends. In certain parts, I'm not too worried about losing detail in my image over here, because that's not necessarily where people are going to look. But within the eyes, for example, that's definitely somewhere that I want to make sure that I'm not losing my detail. So I'm going to try and work my editing to hold the detail within that image, simply in this case by lifting up, for example, exposure. But there are definitely ways that you can go and play around and mess around with the different sliders to get to that sweet spot. So now we move down here to presence, and our first slider is texture. And basically, texture is going to lift or decrease the texture within an image. So you can see how it starts to get this image starts to get a much softer feel to it. If we start to lift back up, all of a sudden we start to pick up quite a bit of texture. And texture is something to keep in mind when it comes to your photos. This is something that draws people's attention to a specific spot. So you can focus on bringing texture onto this lioness, and that's something that you could use to draw people's attention to the subject of your image. So that's something that you should always keep in mind. Secondly, we've got clarity, and the clarity slider enhances your image. It's also a way of increasing or decreasing texture. It can add or decrease texture to an image. And secondly, what clarity also does is it adds structure to our midtones. So if you have a look up here at our histogram within our midtones, if I move this clarity slider, you can see if I decrease my clarity, again, those midtones become a little bit more compact. If I increase my clarity, all of a sudden those start to get stretched out. We get a bit more structure within those midtones. So again, just a matter of playing around with that, finding the sweet spot. Next, we've got our dehaze slider. And what dehaze does is it adds or removes atmospheric haze from a photo. So if you happen to have, for example, haze in an afternoon or something, you can either remove or increase that. If it adds a bit of a feel to your image, you can increase that. If it's something that you're more wanting to get rid of, you can remove that. And you can see it also works our midtones up here and adds a little bit of contrast, makes the darker areas darker and the lighter areas a little bit lighter. So that is our dehaze. The second last one is vibrance. And what vibrance does is it adds saturation to a photo, but it does it in a smarter way than the saturation slider. Vibrance, it's not an absolute adjustment. However, it protects already saturated tones and colors typically found within skin tones, call it that. So stretching this out, as I said, it will decrease saturation, or to the right, it will increase saturation. And lastly, our saturation, these two sort of work hand in hand. Our saturation tool will adjust the color intensity of all the colors in the photo. So if I decrease it, you can see we lose our color intensity. If I increase that, it increases the color intensity. So that is it, guys. That is the basic panel. I hope that made a bit of sense to you. I try to keep that as basic as possible. On top of that, a couple of quick tips that I think could be useful for you if you are starting up with Lightroom. If you come up to, firstly, if you happen to change a couple of sliders and you're busy editing and you've changed and you want to bring your image back to, or bring all of these sliders back to 0 and start again, a quick little trick for that is you can come on, let's say the word here, blacks, and if you double click on that, it will take it back to 0 immediately. Instead of, coming right down here, trying to bring this down, just double click on there, or on the slider itself, double click there, and that will bring it back to 0. So that's quite a cool little trick there. Another little quick tip, if you right click on basic, or any of these for that matter, let's say any of these names here, you come on here, you right click on here, you want to be on solo mode whenever you are working in Lightroom. And the reason being is if you are off of solo mode, what that does is you can then open all of these tabs and it becomes quite a scrolling process to get to where you want to be. So what you want to do is you rather go right click on here, make sure that solo mode is ticked, and what that will do, that will ensure that only one of these panels is open at a given time. And that just makes it a lot neater, a lot quicker, and a lot more efficient when it comes to your editing. And lastly, you can customize this entire Lightroom panel to your preferences. If you happen to work on your effects more often than not, you can get that right to the top. You can change the order, your detail, you can bring it up there. If you don't use any of these panels, you can come over here, you can click those and get rid of them and save that, and then just like that, it will be set to your preferences. So yeah, guys, that is it from me. I hope that you guys take something away from this video. Thank you so much for your time. If you happen to have any questions on this video specifically, or any topics that you'd like me to cover, get in touch with me. My Instagram as well as my email will be on a slider at the end of this video, and you guys are more than welcome to get in touch. Thanks again. My name is Michael. Once again, I appreciate your time. Have a great day, and I look forward till next time. Cheers, guys.